A way other than our own. Our theme for our Lenten journey this year, a way other than our own. As we have journeyed through these days of Lent thus far, we've been remembering the gifts of God's grace, the gifts of God's creating grace, the gifts of God's seeking grace, calling us to be God's people, the gifts of God's sustaining grace, staying with us even when we are unfaithful. Now this morning we find ourselves again facing the question of recognizing the action of God, how the grace of God is made known in this passage. We heard a very brief part of a longer chapter and a longer story, and I would invite you and encourage you to read all of John chapter 9 when you get home today or sometime during this week. It's a beautiful story, and it has many twists and turns. So we've heard only a portion, so let me share with you more of what happens in this story. This is an encounter between Jesus and a man who is born blind, who is healed by Jesus and then questioned about his experience. It's a surprising story for this man to relate and to share because he has been blind since birth and apparently now begs for his existence. And somehow he is assumed to be the victim of the consequences of sin, either his own sin or the sins of his parents. So the beginning of this text and of this encounter with Jesus comes from a question by Jesus' disciples. Who sinned that this man is blind? Well, it's a pretty fascinating starting point, and it exposes an understanding of who God is and of what sin is. Jesus refutes that assumption. He refutes the assumption that this physical state is somehow representative of a spiritual state. In fact, he moves to heal the man rather than to bring condemnation. And with that act, with the act of Jesus to bring healing, the true debate begins. Who has brought this healing? Is this healer from God? Is this healer to be recognized as one who is making God known? Those are the questions that are before us when we encounter God's mercies. Who is this healer? We began this Lenten journey acknowledging that always, as we take a journey of self-examination, that what we begin with is an understanding of seeking who God is. It's as we seek to know more of who God is that we learn about ourselves. Our self-reflection always starts with a God reflection. And what we have seen so far is that this is a God who creates life out of the very dust of the earth and who calls a people into being so that they may participate in making God's blessings of shalom, of wholeness, of peace, and of God's steadfast love and mercy, making God's blessings known to all creation. We've seen this God choose to embody faithfulness, even when, as we say in our communion liturgy, our love failed and we turned away. In creating a covenant people, God, through Moses, commits to see the people all the way through the wilderness into the promised land, even when their temptation had been to settle for a God who is so much smaller, so much more predictable and manageable than this creating and covenant-making God proves to be. It's from these Old Testament texts that we have heard in recent weeks that we now move into the ministry of Jesus. And the struggle is still present. Will we recognize the gracious and generous God who seeks to dwell in our midst, to transform life, and to challenge the limited expectations that we may place on how God will act in our lives or in the lives of others. A way other than our own requires us to have an openness for God's mercies to be made known. It's fascinating to me in this text that the healing work of Jesus generates conflict rather than joy. Conflict rather than joy. Here's something miraculous that has happened in their midst. And yet what ensues is a grand and glorious and prolonged argument. The disciples, rather than seeking healing for the blind man, want to know who to assign blame for his condition. The neighbors, who have known the man all of his life, are somehow unable to recognize him. He looks like the one who was born blind, they say, but he can't be because now he sees. The religious officials, the Pharisees, are offended that the healing happened on the Sabbath and out from under their supervision. Ultimately, these conflicts result in the man who once was blind to be thrown out of the synagogue, and it is there that he is found by Jesus once again. It's only the man who is healed who seems to have an openness to a new way of being and who expresses trust in God's continuing faithfulness. Through his reflections, we hear his own understanding of how God is at work begin to develop and grow. When Jesus first comes to the man, he is blind and apparently is not actively seeking healing. So it's not surprising that he has to report what he has experienced through what he's heard. So his first answer to who healed you is, this man named Jesus is the one who healed me. As he continues to tell his story, he begins to bring into sharper focus his understanding and expression of who is at work with him. His description of Jesus moves from this man Jesus to this man is a prophet, one who makes God known. That's how he answers the Pharisees. But as he's questioned again and ultimately thrown out of the synagogue for his challenging of the Pharisees about whether they're able to see, Jesus comes to him again. And this time, he identifies Jesus as his Lord. In this amazing story, we see how our own relationships with God often develop. As we're found by God's grace and transformed by God's presence in our life, then we begin to tell the story of how we've experienced his touch. We begin to claim in our own story the work of God. We begin to recognize the significance of who Jesus is for us. Is Jesus just an interesting teacher? Okay, we might say yes to that. There's truth to that. Is Jesus a prophet? Is he a messenger of God? Okay, we might say yes to that too. There's truth there as well. But is he Lord? Is he the one who surpasses the powers of the world in ordering our lives? Is Jesus the one whose healing touch is transformative for us and in fact defines us? Is Jesus the one we receive with thanksgiving when he comes to us when all others have left us abandoned? There's an element of openness in the life of the man born blind that begins to paint the picture for us of how faith grows, of how God's steadfast love and mercy are known. This God often finds us when we aren't even looking. We call this prevenient grace. This God seeks us out when we may consider ourselves in a permanent state of blindness and may find ourselves wondering if there's something we or someone around us has done wrong that's left us in a state of not seeing. This God stays with us through our growing and accepting of God's work in our life, journeying with us as we question, as we find our words to tell our story, as we integrate God's story into our own, and our understanding develops and matures. This God continues to come to us, to invite us into a defined relationship, one of discipleship, one of sight, to follow in God's ways. As we move through this naming of ourselves as God's own, what we call the experience of justifying grace, we move into a realization that we are sustained by God's grace even as we continue in the life of faith. And we find, thanks be to God, we find that grace is sufficient for us, sufficient to sustain us, to perfect us, to help us to continue to grow in the ways of God's mercies. Diana Butler Bass is an author who has written a book recently that's entitled Grateful. Grateful. In her work, she discovered the profound changes that occur when we live from an attitude of being grateful. Changes that transform not only our personal experiences, but our social and cultural relationships. As she did her research for this book, she Googled for images related to the word grateful. She said the number one image was this. In her image, it's one of a person standing on a mountaintop. But she said as she began to explore and to talk to persons that she found in most people's phones, there was some image that looked similar to that. Some picture they had. It might be by the seashore. It might be on a mountain. It might be the arms of a child. It might be extending to another. But somewhere there would be this image of extended hands, open to receive what God offers. Not only to us, but to all creation. It's a receiving of God's abundance for us. She said as she continued her work and looking for images that she realized that we move from this general recognition and general gratitude for God's grace and mercy to an attitude of personal thankfulness that we express with hands over our hearts as we recognize God's grace in our own lives, in our own stories. But she said it doesn't stop there. Grateful hearts, she came to realize, move into a relationship with others in a broader and more inviting way, in a way that recognizes the gift of gratitude that we have and the gift of gratitude that we have for others, for all that we receive and give one to another. She said the life of being grateful moves from the open arms to the beating heart to the praying hands. From all that God seeks to offer to all that God offers to us, to all that God shares between us, one to another. That's the significance of this Lenten journey. We are watching the ways that God's ways of being have been revealed to us as creator of all of life and of a called humanity. as Redeemer of a called people who turn away, of limited humanity, caught in our own blindness, even when it's sometimes not of our own making. We have seen God revealed to us as a sustainer of humanity, who draws us into a relationship with God that overflows into how we live our lives with each other, that honors the presence of God in the other, and that recognizes that Jesus is who sets our course and sustains our way. From here to here to here. You know, too often we settle for far less. We limit our naming of God's actions, and then we begin to turn on each other. We move into isolation. We move into posturing. We become defensive, and we miss the opportunity to name God's presence, to see God's activity, and to strengthen each other in response to God's calling. This way of Christ is a way other than our own. It's a way that leads us to openness. Openness to have our preconceived ideas of how God is at work to be challenged and transformed. The way other than our own opens the door for us to meet God again as if for the very first time. You see, this God still calls. This God still creates. This God still forgives and restores and still meets us to strengthen us for life as his disciples. The question that stays before us is whether we will have the eyes to see, or whether our ways of being, our convictions, our fears and failings will leave us in our blindness while we are professing to see. A posture of gratitude, of receiving what God seeks to offer, of entering fully into the story of God's shalom, God's hesed, God's faithfulness and mercy. This way leads us to life, to sight, to following more dearly day by day. Would you try it with me? May we receive all that God seeks to offer to us. May we experience it in the very core of our being, and may we share it one with another and even with all the world. Amen.